My name is Soania Mathur. I'm a family physician and someone who's diagnosed with PD over 26 years ago. I'm privileged to serve on the board of directors for the Davis-Phinney Foundation, and I also have the pleasure of being your moderator today. Neurological disorders are still the world's leading cause of disability, and of those illnesses, Parkinson's disease is still the fastest growing. It's estimated that Parkinson's affects 11.8 million people worldwide, with that number expecting to grow at an alarming rate. PD remains incurable, and we have yet to have any medications that can modify progression of the disease. But as we will learn today, these are being actively pursued. There are also symptomatic treatments in development that work to optimize our quality of life while we wait for those disease-modifying treatments. The research continues to move forward, and we'll talk about some of those emerging therapies today. Michael, you are the author of several books. Your newest one that you co-authored with Dr. Ray Dorsey, The Parkinson's Plan, A New Path to Prevention and Treatments, has officially come out since our last update. It's available, I believe, for purchase online. I personally found it to be highly informative, and it gives you so many actionable directives. It's an absolute must-read. So congratulations on the success of the book and how well it's been received.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here. And of course, Ray and I make sure that we spread out the love for the sales on that book to charities and Parkinson-related causes. And so it's an honor to be here with you. I can't believe we're at 5 years, Sonia. But it's so important for us to give this opportunity to update folks. And I always love how you blitz me every year, with everything. And so, you never know what's coming with Sonia. So it's always a lot of fun to do this webinar and to think about all the new things that are coming.
In order to keep ourselves organized, I'm going to approach the topics by sort of larger sections. So prevention, symptomatic treatment, and disease-modifying treatments. So let's start with prevention. So what we're talking about here is how to prevent disease from starting in the first place, based on what we know about the potential toxicity in our environment, other conditions that may predispose us to developing the disease, and actual modifications that we can make in our lives and lifestyle to prevent people from going down this road in the first place. And in your book, The Parkinson's Prevention Plan, you speak a lot about environmental exposures and the risks of Parkinson's, which is really vital information to have, especially when it comes to others that may be at risk. Could you discuss briefly some of those exposures to avoid? And also, I'm wondering, do we have any evidence of avoiding these environmental exposures will slow down the progression of disease that in those of us that are already diagnosed with PD?
Yeah, so we're learning a lot, and I always say every day I practice medicine, I know a little less. And so when we begin to think about environment and we think about its impact on disease, it's something that I think that it's coming, and it's been coming, and now it's finally here, and it's time for us to really be advising people and to start to think about what are these impacts. Part of this comes from the idea that only about 15%, 15 out of every 100 people that have Parkinson have a single DNA change in their genes that may relate to their Parkinson. And so that leaves you with sort of a large number of people, 85%, who might have multiple genes that are working together, or there's some other factor like an environmental factor. And so, we really need to key in and see, why are we seeing these cases, this rise that you're seeing in Parkinson cases? It's now the fastest growing neurodegenerative disorder. We have to ask ourselves why it starts, why it spreads, why it progresses, right? But also, what are key factors that may be, influencing this? Why are young people getting Parkinson? And why do only 20% of young people with Parkinson have a gene associated with it? And so when we think about environment, we think about prevention. So when we think about prevention, we think about primary prevention. Could we prevent it for this generation and for the next? We definitely have that responsibility. Ray Dorsey and I, we like to talk about, food, water, air. Food, wash your fruits, get either a copious amounts of water or a vegetable wash. Get the pesticides off. The pesticides are there to keep the food supply, and to keep the bugs off of the food, but they're not there for you to consume. We know there are high increased risks of pesticides like paraquat associated with Parkinson. Get active with making sure that we push for those bans of those pesticides. And remember also, it's not enough that one manufacturer comes off the market, these things are generics, just like generic drugs. And so they're viral. So we need to stay on this, making sure we get rid of pesticides in our environment. So our food, our water, carbon water filter, Sonia, on your refrigerator, make sure you change it. If you don't have one on your sink, make sure you've got one on your sink if you're drinking the water out of your sink. And if you have well water or you live rurally, much higher risk of Parkinson. We've known this for years. We just haven't acted on it and told people that we need to act on these things. Okay. And then
Right.
air. So air purifiers in your house, super important to have and to be thinking about. And so especially if you live next to a golf course or if you live in an area with a lot of pollution. Now, if you do have Parkinson already, we always tell the story, if you're a smoker and you get diagnosed with lung cancer, what's the first thing your doctor tells you to do? Stop smoking. So if you have Parkinson and you're diagnosed with Parkinson, we still think about doing these things. We enumerate them as the Parkinson 25 for people with or without Parkinson. So it doesn't absolve you just because the cat's out of the bag. And there's every reason to believe that these types of exposures could worsen your symptoms with Parkinson if you continue to be exposed to them. And so we're learning a lot. It's humbling. Those are the main points, I would say, very pithy points that I would point out to our listenership.
Great, thank you. Because you always wonder, is it just for the future generations, which is so important, but is there something that we can do to help ourselves, even though we have the diagnosis already? So that's very helpful. Thank you.
Of
Um,
course.
there was also a study that I saw sort of in the realm of prevention, I guess, um, called the Global Burden of Obstructive Sleep Apnea. And this was a study where researchers looked at, like, I think millions of veterans, and they found some evidence that supports that sleep apnea might be a modifiable risk factor. Could you explain those results and what that means to our community?
Yeah, so this was a really important study. It came out, toward the end of 2025, and that was in print in JAMA Neurology, which is one of the leading journals for this type of work. And it was done by Lee Nielsen, who's out in Oregon Health Sciences Center and in the VA. And they,
Yeah.
like you've mentioned, there were over 11 million veterans that were in this study, and they were looking at sleep. And remember, sleep is one of those things that you and I have been talking about. We're in our 5th year together and how important it is. But how about this one? It turns out that obstructive sleep apnea could be a risk factor for Parkinson and could be a potential treatment in terms of symptomatic benefits. And they went back and, why are they interested in this? Well, it turns out when you don't get enough oxygen from, obstructive sleep apnea, that's where you have problems breathing while you're sleeping, Sonia, and then you not getting enough oxygen, you get that intermittent, what they call hypoxia, which is just big doctor jargon for meaning you're not getting enough oxygen into those cells. It can lead the powerhouses of your cells, like your mitochondria, to be stressed out. It can promote degeneration in pathways that might be relevant to Parkinson. And of course, if you put on one of those masks and you get the positive airway pressure called CPAP, you may be able to do something about this. And what happened is when they looked at the association, they saw there was associated, obstructive sleep apnea was associated with a risk of later getting Parkinson disease. And they adjusted for everything you can think about: their age, their, how much they weighed, their mortality, other things that they had. And they found out that in untreated obstructive sleep apnea, some of the analysis came up to as much as 2 times increased risk. And so we talk about early treatment with CPAP. We talk about, could we modify the pathway? We don't know. We talk about this as a potential midlife risk factor and something to pay attention to. So another reason, as we pile on, Sonia, you and I, onto sleep with everybody who listens to you and I, talking about these things, obstructive sleep apnea, more common in Parkinson, might even be a risk factor. Treating it may also benefit some of the symptoms. So we're learning, and then we're really interested in this intermittent hypoxia type of research.
Right. I mean, that's really interesting because it's going to come up later on in discussion, but it's important from a symptom perspective and also maybe from a prevention or a disease modifying perspective, which is really quite interesting. Like sleep, we also hear a lot about exercise, and that's something that is constantly preached to us. So we are always told it's absolutely vital to help with quality of life when you have PD, but does it really change the course of the disease, or does it make you just feel better? And there's a study that's being done called Slow Speed, Slowing Parkinson's Early Through Exercise Dosage. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, so this, sort of drip, drip, drip of evidence that now has caused all of the experts to start fighting. Is exercise symptomatic? Does it help your symptoms, or is it changing the disease progression in some way? And so I think this has been a really great formative debate within the field. There's been more and more evidence that there might be a reason to believe that we're able to slow disease progression, at least slightly, when applying things like exercise, and certainly help the symptoms. The thing that was really interesting, Sonia, you bring up this slow speed, sort of study, and that is this idea of slowing Parkinson early. The key word here, Sonia, is early through exercise dosage. And the idea is you want to get people in that they use that word prodrome. Some people like that word, some people don't. So when you hear the word prodromal, it just means like symptoms that may occur early on or even before the Parkinson, but you may actually have Parkinson. But at any rate, when you hear that word, it's like, acting out your dreams, smell, constipation, smell loss, those types of things. And the idea in slow speed was they were going to use fully remote scalable models using smartphone apps and wearable devices. They're going to try to dose and increase your exercise over time. And the idea is, could you make those dopamine neurons more resilient and function better? Could you make them more plastic and help the different, what we call synapses, to be communicating with each other? And could you improve those powerhouse parts of your cells called the mitochondria and reduce, the stress that's on the cell that sometimes docs call oxidative stress and scientists call oxidative stress? The thing about this study that's interesting is that it sort of is dose dependent. It has different exercise intensities. It's going after early prodromal Parkinson. It has a randomized design. It's fully remote. It's potentially scalable. They're using biomarkers through digital biomarkers, and they're also interested in blood imaging, digital measures and things. And it's a global platform. And so I think it's really important. And just so folks know, as you talk about prevention, I love the fact that you decided you were going to blitz me on prevention first. I love that, because this is one of those efforts where we're going toward, secondary prevention, people who already have Parkinson, but getting it early on. And we talked just a moment ago about primary prevention, keeping the next generation from getting Parkinson. And so we need to start doing that. Low cost, globally scalable interventions for prevention are really important.
So that kind of brings me into the next topic I wanted to just briefly talk about. We know that in some instances you can be at increased risk to develop Parkinson's disease because of a genetic mutation, like LRRK2 or GBA. Now, we also know that just because you have the gene doesn't mean you'll develop the disease. So is there any use of getting your genetics tested from a prevention perspective?
Yeah, what a great question. Answer, probably, likely, maybe. Don't you love it when we hedge like that, when we won't give you a straight answer on these things? I mean, it turns out that the minority of people have one of these 7 most common, gene types. So certainly if you have one of those, you can get into a clinical trial. We know, a lot more about the pathways of those genes. They might help us to predicting how we're going to treat other disorders, and we might move toward cancer. We're likely going to move toward cancer. So when you see on TV, I would like to have this chemotherapy regimen if you have this genetic abnormality, right? We're going to move into that stage for neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson. We're not quite there. I do think it's useful to have your genes tested to know sort of where you are, particularly as we begin to personalize, the therapy. So Parkinson Foundation with Indiana University, Michael J. Fox Foundation, GP2, so many of these things. I think it's great to have those things, but don't panic. Make sure you have genetics counseling, and make sure here's the one thing I would just say, make sure you realize this. This ain't 100%. You get a gene. It doesn't mean you're going to get the disease just because you have the gene. A lot of people are going to carry the gene and never get, Parkinson disease. GBA1, 90% of people are going to carry that and not end up with Parkinson disease. We don't know why. There's some breadcrumbs there we need to figure out as scientists. LRRK2, LRRK2, only 30% are going to get it. And so just, being cautious, and then once you get your own gene status, if it's positive, being careful about doing genetics counseling if you want to bring your kids or your family in, because even if they have that gene, they may not want to know or live with something that may or may not happen. I think it's really important. People have a right to know. we tend to have these conversations. Sonia, you're a family practice doc that need to be longer, and the healthcare systems don't let us share these longer things with folks. And so I think sharing this is important.